So this is going to be another one of my donator discussions, and we're going to have 2 new people on this one. And by the way, technically, if people don't know, like there's an invitation to anyone who is one of the $100 patrons to be a part of these, and potentially I might even do like 2 a month if it was needed for scheduling. It's just some people. I mean, some people just bizarrely actually don't even want to do it. They're just like, nah, I just like supporting you. I don't necessarily want to come on the talk show, or they just, the schedule didn't align for them. So if people ever want to come on, like anyone who hasn't been on one yet, just hit me up. In fact, if you're even a former patron, you just never ever took advantage of it, you want to do one now and you're not, again, just message me. I could probably hook it up for you. So on this, one of my traditions is, if you've never done one before, we usually let you go first, because the premise is, much like the famous concept they say for musicians, that the first album's like the album you've been waiting your whole life to make. Presumably, if you want to be a patron of mine at this stage, you probably have some questions or topics you'd like to talk about with me, so let's go ahead and do that. So Matt, do you have an opening gambit for us, a topic you'd like to start us with?
Yeah, so I was curious about the mid-jungle dynamics in League, and I wanted to know what your thoughts were on the leader self-made. Because a lot of the LPL watching I've done, I've seen a lot more of like the aggro mid laner has a supportive jungler, and the like roaming supporting mid laner has the carry jungle. Whereas like they're both essentially carries in Vitality.
Yes.
I wonder if that's like causing them any issues, or if it's literally just the team not being a good team.
Like, put it this way, I sort of see the way you set it up there, especially and characterize it towards the end, because the problem is, I agree, like, individually, they obviously are both, like, potential star players, but it doesn't necessarily seem like the sort of, like, they don't really have overlap. They're either, like, the same type of player, or they don't connect in some ways, as you're alluding to, you probably want to. Like, yeah, I don't know, I have a hard time with that myself, because I do feel as though they probably should play with different players from those 2 roles, basically, and they could probably be better. But the problem is, in the team that they're in, they are arguably the best elements of that team. So, I don't know. Bear in mind, I don't think they're probably going to Worlds, and they're definitely almost certainly not winning LEC. Odds are there might not be any self-made in the team for next year, so it might not matter. But I do find it a bit underwhelming. Like, basically, I don't put much of it on leader. I put a lot of it on self-made, actually, because if you look at his career, I think that guy can sort of only play one style, mate. I think he is amazing at it. Like, he genuinely is one of the best in the entire world when the meta's there to play it. But I don't actually think he's like a player like Jankos and others have become, where they basically have like an all-round game. They can do sort of whatever jungle you need. So I almost feel like the other problem as well is, forget like even how they want to play it. I think their strengths are a bit too limited, and there's not enough overlap between them. What are your thoughts on it, though?
Watching the LEC has been not even been too analysis driven on it. So from what I've seen, is like a lot of leaders' mistakes. He hasn't like popped off as much as I was expecting in the season, and he's like made some like mistakes which are like not good, like dying under tower and stuff in some of the earlier games. And watching the pathing of self-made, I didn't really watch a lot of Vitality games. I mostly watch FNATIC because I'm a Bipple fan, but in general, I just think, based on LPL and Doinb and Kian, I think that system and like what made me think about it. So I just think leader and self-made both kind of underperformed for expectations coming into the split. And just like,
the only problem with that one is, though, mate, like, even though I get your premise there, you've probably picked like the harshest example to contrast them with, because like Doinb is, if nothing else, like absurdly unusually good at being someone who can work with his jungler for a mid laner. Like, he's probably the ultimate example of the guy who sort of like doesn't give a fuck about his lane, although he does actually lane very well now, but just, cares about like moving around the map with the jungler and creating plays. So like, I would say a lot of people would fail against that standard, including a lot of LEC greats,
I mean,
right, yeah.
How about like another comparison would be like Jankos and Caps, because Jankos has been like that super hyper aggressive jungler in the like earlier days of his career, and then he has like a mid laner who's hyper aggressive. So maybe it's not like necessarily like only the fact that they both like to play aggressive, but it's more like the way they want to play the game, like how they want to play the specific style. Like if they want to go through lane, or they want to do it through map movement.
Yeah.
The problem is like, yeah, go on, Matt.
I think if it's more about like being on the same wavelength between the mid and jungle. It's probably more important. And I don't think like self-made and leader don't seem to have connected then. Basically the problem I see with them as players is
of the two players, I'm sorry, if you know anything about League of Legends, the game, and especially in Europe, like mid lane will always be the most important position in the game. Like I don't care how strong the meta is in any other regard. The mid lane is, first of all, he's a laner, he gets all the farm, he has the agency over the map. Like there's a million factors. The champions are usually absurdly strong. So as a result, here's the problem. I don't mind if Selfmade wants to play the way like we're alluding to. Maybe he wants to play the game or sees the game if he has Nemesis or someone else as his mid laner, even if he'd have had Niski. The problem is, if you have Leader as your mid laner and you don't want to play around him and get him super fed and carry the game, you almost don't want to win League of Legends at that point in time, mate. Like, you carrying from the jungle, it's probably not going to be as good beyond, like, if you get, like, say you had, like, Viego, now it's a pretty OP champion. Aside from that, it's just probably not as good a way to play the game. So my issue is this. It's one thing if you were in a team in the past where, like, you know, your mid laner socked, like when Selfmade was in SK or something. The problem is now, in theory, the best player in his team is the mid laner. So the fact that they don't really, like, seem to, like, they don't have terrible synergy. They're all right. It's just that, like, I don't really feel like I wouldn't put them as like a top jungle mid duo. And the reason that's so disappointing to me is, it's not like I'm asking Selfmade to be the best fucking like 24/7 gank jungler. He just has to get Leader ahead. And with the current meta and the picks that Leader plays, if they even actually both sort of like embraced roaming, they could both just fucking gang bang the top of the bot lane. It's just unfortunately in their team, they don't seem to give a flying fuck about top lane. So they also have some weird sort of like archaic mentality of how you play the game, it seems. Like, I actually think that team in general is just not very well set up.
Yeah, they're kind of like the epitome of solo queue like team, because they want to dominate the specific opponent, like it's almost a one-on-one game for them. So,
problem is that just doesn't really work anymore if you know it's in League.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
The era when you can do that. Like, I mean, put it this way: if anyone watched today the LPL, Top Esports is out already of the playoffs. Like, there's a team that plays like that. They just have a bunch of individually mega players that draft whatever they want and just run at you and start attacking you. The problem is that doesn't win you the game in League of Legends anymore, unfortunately. You have to be a coherent team with a proper style and players who understand how to play for each other. It's actually probably the most interesting part about League, I think, is like it's a game where you can very clearly see the dynamics of how people work with each other, which is bizarre because obviously, like in theory, it's not supposed to have as many comms as CS. You can just sort of see it with how they play the game. So I've always found that quite interesting, but I do notice a lot of other people tend to ignore it and just sort of treat the players as if they were individual players. Because both these players we're talking about right now, I absolutely still think are very skilled players who one day could be like MVP candidates. Just in this particular team, it's just a bit meh, isn't it? It's not bad. Like, you still have some pretty sick sort of one-offs, you know, but it's nothing great. Like, for example, I don't anticipate it's going to be a great series in terms of them, like, being impressive tomorrow. They'll probably be just lose 3-2 or something, you know?
So just to kind of direct the conversation. So, right. So, these two players, Selfmade and Leader. So these, assuming that the LEC doesn't, they don't go to Worlds, right? So what do you think is a good direction as far as what Vitality does with these two players, right? Because theoretically, these two players don't necessarily mesh well together. Like, do you let Selfmade go? Do you let Leader go? Like, what do you kind of like? What's the speculation? Is there any kind of speculation as far as like hot prospects maybe that could slot in and potentially fill one of those two holes?
Do you follow CSGO only, Kris?
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm talking about. So yeah.
Right, okay. Here's the thing: if either of you two want to answer that, you can answer that. Otherwise, we'll shift topic.
I mean, the easy choice would be Selfmade because he's already like proven. But I think that, like in this situation, they should gamble on Leader because like what does Vitality have to lose at this point, really? Like, it's not like they are going to next year improve and go up in the standings if they like stay with this squad. So I think they should focus more on like creating, like building him up, because he barely had like any split when he was on the Misfits roster,
sure, which
was like a complete, that was them tanking his career even before it began.
What do you think, Matt? What would you pick? Well, I already assumed that because they signed Leader to that short contract, they'll probably just Selfmade to that short contract. They'll probably keep Leader, but I just don't know what like the prospect for jungle. So who do you swap in jungle, keeping Leader? Is there even a good player there?
You can.
That's the problem, isn't it? Part of the problem I will say is like their coaching staff does originally come from the ERLs, as far as I know. So I would suspect they all think like there's a bazillion great players in the ERLs, blah blah blah. Hence where they got leaders. So they probably do think there are loads. Like if you notice some talk shows, coaching staff and people who are in the scene in LEC act like there's 200 good players. I personally think there's like a way smaller pool, and we're sort of panning for gold here, and you are going to find a lot of shit along the way. But I don't know. Like, the thing is, I also can't entirely hate on the talent pool. Like, remember, you did have people like Razork and El Yoya come into the league within the last 2 years who, like, I mean, who knew they were just down there in the RLs, right? So it's not impossible. I personally would like, like I alluded to, I would just like them to find a way to make these two players work. Like, I think if you take these two players, you just change all the rest of the team, or maybe, like, keep one of the bot lane or something, or get the right top laner. I think already you can make it a really good team.
Get some role players, perhaps, for the team.
That's smart. That's the main problem they have, isn't it? They don't have a single role player. Like, I don't think people realise if you didn't follow years ago, dude, the players who are in their bot lane are supposed to be carry players as well. Like, every player on their team basically is supposed to. Even Segenda, who now is basically the weak side player, in the ERLs he was the carry player. Like, give me a break, mate. They made a team literally that's like 5 carries basically, and then they wonder why doesn't this team function well together? And then you go and look at teams in any region that are on top. There's nearly always a team that's like, they're not all star players, like some decent players, but they just mesh well together. Right, what's the next topic? How about this Wisetown? What would you like to transfer to now? What should we talk about, mate?
All right, so this is like in general, not for like specifically League of Legends or Counter-Strike, but I have been wondering this for the like longest time, but I don't think there's enough of like experimentation in the pro scene in any like esports. And the reason why I've come to that conclusion was like we had so many years where the bot lane in League of Legends specifically was like stuck in its ways, where it was only traditional marksmen playing the ADC role, whereas after the 2018 year, where all the majors moved down in the bot lane, and then we had G2 that revolutionized the way you played the game, and then in Counter-Strike you had the gun like the Krieg and the Orc that was overpowered for such a long time and nobody used it. And that's like why I'm wondering why pro players aren't more willing to try out different ways to play the game instead of like staying their own way, like stuck in their way.
Okay.
I've got a couple of points to kind of jump on that, right? So I've done a smidgen, right, of professional play, and just to kind of like lend some insight into what it means to like be a professional player, is you basically have to be on top of not only what you are doing as an individual, right? You have to be on top of what your team are doing as a group, and what individual pieces in that group want to do, and then also what your opponents are wanting to do. And and there's a lot of research, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of study that kind of goes into kind of any esport, right? So I'm talking specifically about some VR Pavlov is what it's called, a game that it's not exactly like a gigantic esport, right? But I mean the fundamentals are there, right? So the idea is that there's a lot you've got to balance and a lot you've got to manage, right? And then what you're doing is kind of a shortcut. You got to cut corners somewhere, right? Because the idea is to win and do that with the fixed amount of time you've got. So, what you can gain from researching the other team, right? So, like if I watch a couple of demos from the team that I'm about to play, that's going to net me some benefit. But if I spend that time instead using, say, an off-meta weapon, say for instance, let's take CSGO for an example. If I learn all of the nuance behind the P90, right, and just use the P90 in a professional setting, I am not only costing myself the learning that I already have, the understanding of the game that I already have, I am now putting in jeopardy my team, the individual players that that are depending on me to do the role that I need to do. And then I'm also giving the opponent an edge in that I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have as much experience, right? So I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's kind of like you don't really notice it until everyone else is doing it, and it's happened to you, right? So I mean, that's why it takes such like kind of game-breaking things to really like change a whole meta, or developers themselves saying this is how I would like you to play the game now. With League of Legends basically changing the meta, from year to year. So I mean, hopefully that kind of scratches the surface, because at the end of the day, we've got a small bucket of time to work with, and we can only put so much into it. So I mean, I was only wondering
about it because I can't like the game I used to play a shit ton was basically a card game, which like always evolves because you create new decks to counter other decks that are in the meta, and it just like in 1 week one deck can be the most overpowered and the next week it can be the worst because people are trying to revolutionize the way you play the game, and also like mentality wise the game.
Yeah, I think card games are specific because that is part of the skill behind like pro play in card games is like deck building. So that skill is then selected for. So like that creative. Well, I think in the more esports space, you don't see a lot of this creativity because you don't have like people who are like super genius at creative stuff arise, and then they also have to fight against each of their teammates and coaches to then say that this is correct. This creative approach is then here. So it's just like a numbers game where it's just really hard to push in new tech into these games.
You know, Matt, you make an interesting point because you just activated my trap card. Okay. I used to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Professionally, right? And I've also played Magic the Gathering for a very long time. And, you know, those are two different games that both select for different traits, if you will, right? So Magic the Gathering has been around for 25 something years now. A shorthand, a long time, right? There's a lot of cards to play with. There's different formats that allow you to, you know, basically here's the cards that are there. But if you are playing like a legacy format that I play called Commander, you have every card at your disposal, right? There is a whole history of a game that you have that you can put together and make a unique combination that somebody has never ever seen before. Like unique decks are being created every minute right now. You know, that is, you know, it's a lot easier to do something that when you have the breadth of tools available to you, right? You know, whereas you contrast with something like Yu-Gi-Oh, for instance. Yu-Gi-Oh has basically a League of Legends approach where they will release, you know, this is the powerhouse that we're releasing now, so you have to buy the cards. Yeah. This is what we're releasing. You play with this, or basically you're going to get creamed because there's nothing. They are power creep the game, right? So I mean, that's something that, you know, League of Legends they use that to a more purposeful extent. You know, they say this is the champion that we're introducing because we need you to buy the champion, and it's really good. So if you don't use it, you're kind of at a disadvantage. But we need you to get used to this so we can kind of bounce around it and see where it really fits. That's in CS:GO is kind of the Magic the Gathering, right? We have the same formula. You know, here's what it is. You should know how to do all the fundamentals. And when you get introduced to, say, a new smoke, for instance, you know exactly what that smoke does. It's not like a surprise smoke where it just actually goes horizontally instead of a sphere, right? Like, yeah. So I mean, it's kind of like a result of the different games. You get different kind of strategies to overcome them. I mean, this is, you know, the evolution, you know, 101, if you will, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few different angles you can go at this from. Like what you said there, by the way, about let me think. Oh, the contrast with if you were making. Let me think. How did you explain?
Kind of power creep.
No. I mean the other guy before. Let me think how you explained it though. I can't remember what analogy you were given, but basically, like essentially, in Counter-Strike specifically, one of the ways that people try to innovate is literally like making the deck. Is they just recruit different players. So I think one of the problems is people already tend to have blinders based on who they currently play within their team. Of like, I always say this on my shows. It's different if on a show I say something very reductive about a person, like, oh, he's just like a basic bitch entry fragger in CS and that's all he can do. So just, you know, like only give him like simple tactics to run or whatever. Like, I don't want the player in his actual team thinking that and going, right, yeah, you're just a basic bitch who can never evolve and never do anything. Like, I don't, you know, that's appropriate for me as like an observer who in theory isn't being heard by you. But actually a lot of players and teams sort of settle into ruts like that. It's one of the reasons why, to me, the most underwhelming thing about most esports games is how many champions can just never repeat. And the reason they can't repeat is they just really do think they've cracked it and they just keep doing the same shit, playing the same style, doing the exact same role, playing the same maps. Like, just think about that, like MIBR core in CSGO, who just literally had the whole scene by the scruff of the neck and then just over like year by year, just gradually let go more and more and more and more by trying to do the same things until eventually, if people don't know the famous trivia point, by the end, they couldn't play the map Inferno, which the old version of was one of their best maps, if not their favorite map. Like, that's all you need to know right there. Like, they just essentially kept repeating the same thing without innovating, but thinking they should be on top. So that ties into another problem that you have, right? Which is, as bizarre as it sounds, people, when they're doing their practice, kind of like what Kris said there, in the same way as I always say, you can't, it's easy as a fan in Counter-Strike, for example, or League, to say, why don't they play map X, or why aren't they playing champion Y? That's super OP right now. Well, the problem is, like he said there, there's only a limited amount of time to practice. So how much of our time are we going to spend on trying to innovate something that we don't yet know actually is the best or is going to work? Like, for example, just because it's good this week doesn't mean it's good in 2 weeks. So you really have to be a bit ruthless with how you divide your time. So the problem is the teams that aren't on top are likely just going to think, well, I'm having a hard enough time just getting good at what people are currently doing in the meta that we know works. So their logic is basically like, I can't sort of veer too far outside of the current curriculum, as it were. And then there's also that factor of that analogy I just gave there. The logic that you use if you're a normal team practicing what everyone else is doing goes like this. Essentially, everyone else is crowdsourcing for me what the best stuff is. So if I can sort of copy it, I'm going to be within a similar wheelhouse of them. And then if it's a game like CSGO, if I just think I'm individually better, maybe that's enough. Maybe that can actually make me the best team. So unfortunately, a lot of it's to basically like the cynical nature that people have to win the game on Friday, as it were, and it's Wednesday today. And so unfortunately, they're not going to probably think like you or I might, like, oh, well, I'll try and win the major 6 months from now by doing X. Well, they're just going to think, what can I do that's small that I can tweak and get me a small edge in this game on Friday? Yeah. There's a lot of that goes on, you know.
I was just thinking, I had like the conversation in my own head because like all the points that have been brought up was also what I came up with to some extent. But basically, like maybe some orgs should like focus on getting staff in that could like try to do these things, like some like long con, if you will, strategies instead. For League of Legends, I don't mean necessarily like specific champions, but like maybe the best team I can come up with is like G2, because they specifically like the 2019 G2 with all their strategies they came up with. For instance, like their solution to the Zonataric problem, which was, okay, we'll just run funnels so that we'll never lane against them, so they'll have to roam around, but that breaks the entire idea of their composition and their pike top lane against ranged champions up there.
Sure.
That maybe they should like try to get staff in that focus specifically on trying to create these
I think it's a good idea. Put it this way. Basically, think of this analogy. It would just be like having like R&D at a company, research and development, right? So as you're saying, the distinction though is these need to be almost like not entirely separate staff, because obviously they would come with whatever they found to the the main team that's playing the day-to-day, like we were discussing before, and bring their new ideas when they think they've got something. But they need to be like a little bit independent, where the ideas, as we're saying, they're not caught in the cycle of week to week of LCS or whatever. They're doing it separately. The problem with this is, as usual in every area of esports, basically, most people won't ever actually take a chance or spend money until you've proven it worked. And by the time you've proven it worked, nearly they're priced out of it. So the obvious example is this. If half of these fucking idiots in League of Legends had just listened to me, they could actually have literally recruited someone like LS. He would have worked in their org doing this like 4 years ago, and he wouldn't even have been that expensive back then. The problem now is they've waited until he's become arguably like the biggest figure in the entire game, and it wouldn't even be worth his time or money to step out of that bounds and then go and help you on your LCS team. So unfortunately, there are people who could do this, I think, who could sort of generate fresh ideas, and then the idea is you try a couple. If they don't work, you don't mind. If they do, you're ahead of the meta. So there are people out there I think could do it. I do think, you'd have to recruit differently though, because at the moment, even people who have enormous staff, they're all again just caught in the cycle of this week and trying to win this week's games and leaning towards that. There's also the other element I'd say, which goes like this. In Counter-Strike, effectively everyone's innovating all the time. Like tactics themselves are very different from how things are done in League. There's a lot more individual tweaks, variations, specific things to individual players. So a big problem I also think in League, and if you've ever listened to LS's content, you'll know he's very much in the same wheelhouse, is they don't let the patches breathe enough long enough in League. They basically, Riot themselves take the very first set of feedback, which is the game results of win rates and, things they see that seem like OP, and they make another patch immediately from it. Well, if you know anything about games that have a longer patch cycle, making me 3 to 6 months, or in games like Counter-Strike, effectively, some things just never change for years. You don't actually develop some of the really innovative shit until sometimes months and months and years into the game, because sometimes, for example, it's like running into the brick wall of one thing being OP that makes you try a million different things until suddenly you find something that completely counters it, as has happened many times in games like, not League so much because they patch it too much. StarCraft famously, it's happened many, many times in the older versions of the game, Counter-Strike itself. I mean, if people don't know, everyone in here has some basic level of knowledge of Counter-Strike. One of the craziest pieces of trivia ever is that everyone knows something like it was about 3 years ago now that the AUG, the CT rifle was the OP weapon, right? The difference is the AUG had actually been buffed. The Krieg, which was the terrorist version of it, which dominated 2019, hadn't even been changed and was there the whole time in the game, just no one actually tried properly maining it. They just used it like as a joke every now and then. So that no joke, that one gun is one of those ones where it's like a fucking Biff's, the fucking sports almanac moment or Back to the Future. Like, if you could just go back in a time machine and just use that gun in like 2017 or whatever, you would be OP as fucking no one would know what you were doing. They'd be like, why is he using this? Like is he trolling, It would take them literally like a month to realize that you actually have figured out this gun's just way better.
I think BK was actually running the gun in some of the Envious lineups as well, and like people would always comment like, "Hey, why is he using the Krieg? Like, who uses that gun, right? Like the COD gun? Oh yeah, ha 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 ha." This is before the price drop, of course, right? But I mean, still, right? It's the same kind of principle. But what's really interesting is that something like this to kind of tackle that kind of how do we innovate in the game, right? Like we have to have some kind of level of innovation. Is happening around players right now in the Counter-Strike scene with the Academy Leagues. So, I mean, previously we had Academy Leagues that were directly tied to orgs, FNATIC Academy, et cetera, other teams as well. So there's already, a kind of push to, develop younger talent, right? To at least some level above, hey, we pulled them out of FPL and now we need you to carry the game on this LAN. Please, that would be great because all of our waship talent is basically useless now. As we'll kind of talk about down the road. Come back to that. So, but I mean, so the Academy side is like kind of the, the player approach to that, like as we're seeing play out right now. And at the end of it, we may actually have a somewhat entertaining series to watch. That's not just the main circuit of Counter-Strike, that has some rather interesting talents that may end up moving to fill in slots in future rosters that may need to get shaken up down the road, just due to either a player gets burned out, a player pisses away all their talent. We'll come back to that. The idea is that, at least we have some level of innovation where we have a circuit that maybe can make some money around it, can maybe, stop the hemorrhaging from all the cash that we're just blowing. So there is some, level that's kind of going on right now. On the game level, though, I mean, we're still kind of like, I guess we're kind of just stuck in our ways, right? Like the game as far as Counter-Strike goes is constantly being innovated on the way that you play the game, not necessarily, how you move about in the game versus how we actually play the game on a different level. Like there's a different level of innovation that's happening as far as strategy and tactics of how we use things that we already use to take over the game versus how do we, buy this, how do we change our buying strategy to more accommodate a different gun that maybe we want to, abuse. Again, kind of go back to the P90. Let's say we want to abuse the P90. How do we change our buying strategy around something like that? That's something that's not necessarily. Maybe it is being looked into, and all this research has already been done. We haven't even, and it's just already not. Maybe we are at the pinnacle. I doubt it, but maybe there are some guns in Counter-Strike, for instance, that is that's secretly overpowered, and we just don't know about it yet. Maybe. Now I know for League of Legends, right? I know there's a lot more in that game that can happen at a patch cycle that may necessarily need to have some in-depth research done, but kind of like Thorin mentioned earlier, there's not really a lot of time to breathe before we go, actually we're going to tune it down a little bit.
Yeah, I think in League, it's like incredibly hard to do anything with this type of innovation type stuff. But if we talk more about the different, I guess, innovations and like creative, like breaking the game, like, or finding that Krieg thing and or the StarCraft metas that just switch without patches is like, that's like essentially an essence on data mining or a person, whereas like if you're playing the meta against other players, it's more about how are you interacting with your opponents? And that's like a different kind of innovation upon like how you are reading your opponent versus technically improving the game. So essentially the problem with League is like you can't technically improve the game in the champion because the patch cycle's too fast. And like the creative aspect of that is also hindered because of the patch cycle. Whereas like you're never going to recreate 2019 G2 without caps and perks. You're going to need like a gigantic data analyst infrastructure and a bunch of teams that would allow you to do it. So League, I don't think it's just burdened by Riot. So I don't think we'll see.
So is that kind of again coming kind of blind into the League of Legends world? So does that affect the long legacy of certain players? Like does certain patch cycles basically take people who are really good at the game for a long time and basically make them less good? Everyone,
literally everyone in the whole game.
There's actually like a specific situation.
Everyone. Like, if you're the best player in the world, tomorrow you won't be the best player in the world in the next patch necessarily.
There actually was a situation where that happened with, what was it, the 2019, 18 season for FNATIC with ErikHillestad, that he had to leave. He benched himself because the entire, his role became like, just imagine for Counter-Strike that the AWP role disappeared. The AWP just disappeared. That basically happened for him. Like, his entire role just disappeared. Because the meta shifted to a way, to a playstyle that didn't revolve around him playing marksman anymore.
That's
obviously like an extreme example, but yeah, basically League the game is that. But here's the problem, Kris. Like, that conversation you're talking about in the abstract never happens, mate, because here's the problem. The entire game of League of Legends is constant patching. So all people mentally do is they only care about how good are you for the last 3 weeks and how are you going to be for the next 2 weeks. So what they do is, because if they actually acknowledged that the patch and the game was telling you who the better player is, not the player and how good he is, it would be depressing. So people, to avoid that realization, they just brainwash themselves that the best player is the player who adapts the best. Which sounds great on paper, but it doesn't exist if you've ever watched sports or esports. Like, that's like genuinely saying that someone could just 180 their playing style if they wanted it enough. Like, they can't. That's just not, there's no sport I've ever seen that works in,
Yeah, and plus there's such a huge luck element. It's like whoever I invest time into, the skill of mastering. Like, oh, and by the way, in 2 patches you're basically useless. That's
it's actually really depressing in League though, because
so
even
depressing.
beyond, like, as bad as the player performance part is, probably the sickest part. It's actually genuinely disgusting in the context of the fact that esports is trying to become a giant business. Imagine trying to be a general manager and make moves in a game like this. Like, you can genuinely, in the off-season, kill the game and make these amazing signings, and this has happened. Then the next season, it might not even be possible to play League the way that the players you've signed want to play the game. Like, you might actually have, this actually happened, funnily enough, to Astralis' team in League of Legends. They basically signed a team where they had an amazing setup of players to play in this way called side laning in the game. And basically, the next year, Riot made it so that just wasn't even an effective way to play the game. And they had to just do what everyone else was doing. So if you were the guy in the offseason who thought, wow, I've cracked it, I've sort of signed like the sleeper OP team, you actually had, but the game changed under your nose, basically, without you knowing.
That's so interesting, because that happens basically exactly the same way in Yu-Gi-Oh, where basically you buy a whole deck that is meta at the moment, and that's you just wreck everybody for 3 weeks, and then 1 month later they ban the critical card that makes the whole deck, and then bang, you're just out $600. And in Yu-Gi-Oh you just waste $600, but I mean in esports careers you just wasted the player salaries must be insane, because the life cycle must be just so short for players.
Yeah. I think it's the worst part is I think the last 4 world championships we've had, it's not been the team that wins is not always the team that's the favorite. It's mostly a top 3 or dark horse or something like that, but they always have a specific playstyle that fits them perfectly, and then they just hit the perfect patch.
They get hit in the face with the meta, basically. Yeah, exactly.
They just get they just get the patch. For instance, for what was it with the IG? Everybody thought it was a bot lane meta, and then IG proved that no, it's a side lane meta. It's the solo lane meta instead. And then with FPX, it's the jungle mid synergy with the jungle carrying. That fucked over G2, and then we had the Dam one with the jungle carry meta, hardcore jungle carry meta with Canyon. So it's just been a lot of just hitting the right moment pretty much.
Basically, the depressing thing is this, like I just said about the fact that in League, like it's almost like their brains are protecting them all from the realization that would sort of destroy the relevance of the game. Basically, the problem League has as a game is it's actually, funnily enough, even though fans don't know it, it's actually way more akin to what you're talking about with these collectible card games where you're playing like the new limited set and you can't play all the old cards. It's like you've got to just be good at whatever sort of this range of the meta is in this particular tournament this month, and that's about how good you are. But the funny thing is, everyone who follows those games knows those games aren't about whoever won the tournament's number one. You all go off like top 8s and shit, don't you? It's like you just give like the average performance to someone, and you know it depends on what the cards are as to whether they can actually win. The problem is League is more like that. League is basically a game where the meta selects the champion in theory, as opposed to like, I mean, the obvious example would be like a sport like basketball. In theory, like, it's how good you are as a fucking player that probably decides if you win basketball, because the game hasn't changed too radically, so you can practice the things that you think are the best, or that you are indeed the best at, you know. I mean, I've always thought, actually, esports games in the modern era always had a fatal flaw to them, which actually makes them kind of suck, and it goes like this. Imagine, in basketball, you're a massive fan of, like, Steph Curry, for example, an amazing three-point shooter. Imagine if I was able to just ban three-point shooting when I play against him. So now the best ever player at one thing, you never get to see do that. That's fucking games like League of Legends. Games like League of Legends are like, wow, and of course this guy's the best LeBlanc player ever, so they'll be so they'll be banning it every game. It's like, yeah, great. I love tuning in to not see people be good at stuff. Yeah. Fucking hell, whose idea was this?
You can kind of tie it back to like NBA. You know, if you look at some of the 80s clips, you know, of 80s basketball, it was a lot more physical than it is the current iteration. So, you know, it's like, you know, the further back you go, like you get a different gradient of how much the game has changed, you know? So, I mean, and you kind of have that in Counter-Strike as well. It's just, you know, like if you look at Kenny S now versus Kenny S in 2015, you get two different Kenny S's, right? You know, it's just, I guess you get two different size of asterisk, right? So, I mean, I guess from season to season in League of Legends, there's like even bigger asterisks between who wins worlds, you know, from patch to patch or season to season, if you will. You know, so that is the world of, okay, it's interesting. Okay.
I mean, it would be nice if they instead had like maybe 2 patches for one split instead, and then, you know, one patch for the mid-season and one patch for the Worlds.
Problem is, I know what you mean, but you're just never going to get that.
Yeah,
mate, because that's basically where the casual side of the game ruins the game, unfortunately, because they just they're never going to separate the esports product too much from the casual product. They still want it to be like similar, that the idea is you load up right after you watch the LEC game and go play the game, you know. The problem is, basically what you're saying would be perfect for competitive, and people have suggested it many times, like basically have like a set schedule. The problem is, like, Riot, if anything, still want like the esports side to sort of be I mean, I would describe it this way. I'd use their Orwellian term. It has a path to pro. And they really want the fan who's watching to believe if he just goes and plays solo queue that is really good, he's going to get seen by it. You know, like they want him to believe there's a way that he could be in Worlds next year or something. So if we have to create that fantasy world, sadly, there will just be constant patching still. I even think for bad players, it's probably a feature of why League is a popular game. Is like, imagine in CSGO, if you, like, let's say one of you that doesn't play CSGO much, so wisetown like barely plays it, okay. If you play against me, you're going to have a really bad time in CSGO because I've played Counter-Strike for 20 years and the game hasn't fundamentally changed. So I'm going to like the old joke would be true. I've forgotten more things about the game than you're going to know. The problem with this is in a game like League, if you just started this year and I used to be really good and I played it for 10 years, but I haven't played it for a year or two, you might be better than me now if you've been practicing the current meta. I might just be shit. So unfortunately, like that will always be an element of those games. Like I almost think the fact that in those games, it's more about like, have you been playing recently? That's actually a pretty clever, if cynical, strategy to get fans to play your game and to think that like, it doesn't matter if you're bad this month, in a month, they could change the patch and you might be good. Like I've always thought half the reason they make the champions OP in League of Legends is that a noob can look at it and go, I should buy that with my Riot points and then I can win the game. Like that's definitely like a fucking feature, not a bug. You know?
Oh yeah. You know how Riot's bread is buttered because that is definitely, that's a feature, not a bug, right? Because I mean, like they have to introduce a powerful character in order for you to go, oh, you mean if I want to have an enjoyable time playing League of Legends, I have to spend this money right now?
Oh, you don't even enjoy that. Don't worry.
And then the joke is, they go, you don't have to spend the money. It's like, yeah, I can work as like a fucking virtual slave in your salt mine by playing with all shitters in bronze or whatever till I get the actual points to transact. And by the way, everyone knows like the actual rate of like points you earn per hour is absolutely absurd. Like someone once calculated you are basically like working for them for less than minimum wage to play the game or something mad. Right, what's another topic here? What can we transition into here? Does someone have a good one?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I'm a Counter-Strike guy. So there's one topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the team FNATIC, right? They made a big roster move. For those that aren't aware, they are a full Swedish organization on the Counter-Strike side, and they have recently moved to becoming an international roster, adding 2 players from the UK called Alex and Mezzi. And an analyst whose name escapes me because you're right. Whose name is not as big as Alex and Mezzi, right? So they come in, kind of changing things up, and really, so obviously, like there's this topic's kind of been talked to death in the Counter-Strike circles because it's really kind of one of the more exciting moves in the off season that's happened. So that it's been talked about a lot. What does FNATIC do? What's
your angle then, Matt?
So my angle is right. I want to see the first result because that's going to solidify the story of what Golden had. Because I want to know, like, this team was winning. This team was doing great, and then we moved online. There's lots of storylines. Moving online. Da, da, da. If this team literally picks up and starts winning and beating serious opponents, I am going to be livid at Golden, because if you're telling me that you had all of this talent and all it took was somebody just taking the reins and doing something with it, that is going to be incredibly frustrating, because I know Golden, used to be kind of the bullied one of FNATIC, right? He kind of got bullied out of FNATIC a long time ago when he came up from the academy team. They started doing pretty well, and then they kicked him and said, we'd actually rather play it with these things. And they did really good stuff coming towards the end of the pre-COVID period. And if you mean to tell me that all it took was a leadership change and they start doing really well, what Golden could have done with this team will make me incredibly depressed. We'll put it that way.
The only thing with that though is like, even though I get your premise that you want to like know that whether or not he was sort of bad and then you can sort of let him go in your mind. The only one thing is though, like it's not like he got exactly the same team though. Like actually the JW factor, which is the player that obviously got cut so that Mezzi could replace them, that actually could be massively significant, because obviously that's a player that is incredibly influential over your playing style, Like I'm actually not even sure. That's one of those moves that actually I think is kind of unfair that you do at the same time. In my opinion, either JW was a problem, in which case you kick him and you let Golden work with someone else, or Golden was a problem anyway, in which case maybe JW is good if he's under another IGL. You know what I mean? Like you haven't really answered a question when you kick both of them and then recruit 2 new people, except that you just don't want either of these 2 players.
Yeah, that is fair. Because when you see the JW move as well, that's when I start getting nervous, because where's the you get the correlation, but you don't get the causation at the end of it, right? It's like, well, what did cause this team to go? And then there's also, what does the coach, how does this play? How does his role play into the whole dynamic of the team, and whether it's actually going to be able to do something? But the idea is that if even if both of them believe, right? Like if for some reason there's some irresolvable conflict that caused the team to just fall apart, right? Like if that's all it takes to get this team from like 0 to hero, I mean, yay, exciting, but geez, like, could we have just done this, 6 months ago? Maybe we had to wait a contract out, but I mean, like, oh my, you were bleeding down to like 64th. This is like a legendary organization, like, could you not have pulled the trigger a little earlier, right? Could you get the bench warmed a little sooner, right? Like, as a FNATIC fan, I get a little. I'm kind of invested in the success of the team, right? I put my flair on there, and unlike mouse sports fans, I actually keep it that way. Like that's why couldn't we have done this? Couldn't we have done this sooner? I don't know. frustrations of a Fnatic fan. I'm super excited. This team on paper seems really, really good. Like Alex and Mezzi, like seems like they were going to slot in a lot better than MSL and literally anyone else. Because MSL just did not. Obviously, again, we've talked that these points have been talked to death, right? MSL probably not the best. Alex better. Yay, we'll see. But the idea is that we've got these two Swedish talents in Crims and Brolin, and they basically just kind of had to sit on their hands and kind of look like shit for the last like 9 months. Burns me alive. Another
problem as well is, unfortunately, like there's actually a video I should have made, because one of the problems I have at the moment is sometimes it can be hard to actually remember. Did I actually make a real Thorin's Thoughts video on that, or did I just talk about it like 700 times on talk shows and keep saying I should make a video, and therefore my brain tells me like, no, you've already talked about it, you probably did it. Because by the way, there was one time, look, it was only once, where I did actually have something like that, and I was like, I don't think I did make the video. And I tried searching, like Googling, I couldn't find anything, and then when I did make the Thorin's Thoughts, someone linked me to one for a few years earlier. It's like, isn't this the same video? And it wasn't, but it was like I'd sort of picked the same main topic and talked around it like, let's say like 65% the same way. So he had a point. Then again, though, I will say some academics' work is just basically making the same point 700 times, just in slightly different eloquence. So that is also just, sort of in almost like occupational hazard of just being someone who puts out a lot of content. But what I would say is this: if I actually had to pick teams who would fall off in the online era, I mean, you can go back and buy the numbers. I'm pretty sure I must have said it. I had teams like Mouse Sports as obvious teams that should fall off, and Fnatic. But the Fnatic one is the most brutal, because actually all Swedish teams in history who have been elite teams, if you notice, have had like, I wouldn't say like anti-tactical playing style, but they've had a very simplistic playing style in terms of tactics. And like Fnatic themselves, especially that core of JW, Crims, Flusher, they genuinely did have the philosophy of almost like, we already know how to play the game, so why would we do like complicated tactics? Instead, do something simple, and then each of us individually as a veteran and, a top player will make the right decision. Now, the problem with that is, in theory, if you could pull it off, it's actually potentially the best way to play Counter-Strike. If you really had genius players, as they did in 2015 in Fnatic, that would make you an incredibly hard team to beat, because basically the individual players themselves are getting a tiny bit of agency constantly, and if they make the right decisions, they're going to react instantly, whereas the other team has to react as a team. So it can actually be the best way to play. The problem is this: as you can imagine, it revolves around the individual players all being top draw individually. So if your players fall off, and in this case they go online, the ping gets worse, like all these factors come into play that like mean there's loads more people are as good individually as them, you're just not going to be a very good team. Like, you've got nothing going for you at that point in time. You haven't got any innovative element. You haven't got some like tactical edge that you can still beat people with. You just have to win individually. And now in the online era, let's be real, there's probably like 500 people who are comparable to what your level of playing is at. Whereas when we were on LAN, there were, there was like 8 teams that could have done it. And even then, some of them just might not even be good under pressure in the semi-final, whatever. The filters come in. And basically for me in the online era, it's like you took away every filter. So Fnatic had no edge, and you just sort of saw, this is why I don't actually blame them for cutting people like JW. You kind of did just see like, if you take away factors like playing under pressure, playing in front of the crowd, actually some of these players aren't better than FPL players, individually.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to be fair too, it's like, I was watching Launders made a video kind of basically going over, hey, is this Jacquinho guy going to be any good? Should we start talking about like actually replacing him as an op?
What was his take?
His take was basically like, yeah, he does his job. He does it. I actually only watched the first half of it, so I'm actually not even going to like. Does
Launders ever actually flame people in those videos? Because it feels like he's one of those people. I don't know if you know, there's a famous premise in journalism, right? It's kind of like a hack principle. But if in the journalistic headline they ever ask a question, the answer is almost nearly always like no. Because the question will be like, does the United States need a totally new thing to, like, obviously, like the hysterical tone you doing it there, it's not going to say yes, is it? Like, otherwise that wouldn't be the headline, would it? You just say it does need this. So basically, usually in that scenario, people imply like it usually doesn't actually mean that they're going to do that. So.
Okay. So historically, yeah, he's been hard on some players. Yeah, he's been hard on some players. Historically, Rain. He did a demo review of Rain and basically, was like, hey, yeah, his play is really uninspired. And yeah.
Oh, fair enough really then. I was going to say, I actually had the fear that unfortunately he was doing that thing that like my boy Maniac does, where they're almost like too charitable to try and make up for people who are like mean bastards like me.
Yeah, so, like, can we see the good in them?
They try to find a way that like every player who gets flamed sort of is good in some way, I was just wondering if he did that, but fair play if he's actually called people out.
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
So anyway, returning to the point, what was his premise about Giacchino?
So the premise is like, kind of he uses that opportunity of basically explaining what FNATIC does, what FNATIC wants to do in the game, and how they kind of approach a round. Right.
Okay.
So the idea is that, they do have some like, basically they go off of a read. There's some points in the game where they're making just kind of hard reads. It's Mirage. It's a kind of a map. You could just do that, especially with the veteran players that they have. You could basically just kind of feel your way through that map. And he uses that as an opportunity to kind of explain, here's how you play Mirage at a high level. But the short answer is like, yes, there are some like set strats that they do to like, hey, we have a read, let's go move on to a site that, maybe on a higher level may just leave them open to, okay, well, they're just doing the stereotypical pop out of, A connector going towards the A site. And now they're going to do this, and that, and it's, as you kind of were saying before, with some of the interviews with JW and Flusha and them, saying that they do gotta go off an instinctual, we have like some kind of like brain trust that kind of knows the game, and we know that we can fire off a set execute at a hair trigger and just jump and pounce on the enemy, and they will never know. And even though it's kind of like a kind of uninspired strat, the idea is that you do it with such gusto that you can catch teams out and things like that. And you use your kind of your game sense to win onto the opponent. Now the problem with that came, that he basically said, this is kind of like, this is still FNATIC, right? Like, Golden still running the same kind of system that has before. And Giacchino, he does Giacchino things. He fits into the system pretty well. Again, haven't watched the full thing. Those videos are really incredibly long. Just demo review is kind of a drag. So it's FNATIC, but demo review is just kind of a boring subject. Sorry if you're watching this long.
Was FNATIC under any pressure to make replacements during the online era, or are they okay to kind of just ride it out? Because I think
they basically had to. Like, their team was legitimately some absurdly low ranking. I think, aren't they like 40 something or something in the world?
I think it's like 64 or something.
Like, their team, realistically, when we were offline, like, the worst they would ever have been is maybe, like, 20th on a really bad period. Like, they're supposed to be at least, like, a top 15 team, basically. And almost the entire online period, almost a year, they were just fucking terrible. They had, like, rare blips where, like, maybe one tournament where they'd come out of it, and then they'd just go right back in to come in, like, last place at a tournament,
For context, 2 years ago, ESL Pro League, it's basically, imagine it just Worlds, the tiny version, so they were basically in the finals, and I think they actually won Pro League in 2019. They basically won the tournament, one of the 2 or 3 tournaments that were before basically all of the lockdowns happened. They won that tournament, like somewhat convincingly, and then now they are the 64th team in the world, and have basically been doing fuck all since then. I'll be honest.
Yeah,
so it was a bit of a scoffed explanation, but he wasn't wrong in the characterization.
Yeah.
So what this
you going to say, Matt?
Well, what this essentially like an online like motivation problem then, and then like essentially what Thorin said earlier was like you just noticed that these players weren't as good. They were only good because of the LAN setting.
Oh, for sure. And there's lots of rumors about playtime and things like that, that may or may not have been true, and, may or may not fuel, vitriol in my gut and, set fires on my hair. But, the idea is that like, there was like some motivation issues that could have affected, how the team practiced and whether that turned into results, and, how much prep they were doing and things like that. Like, and especially if you look at some of the stat lines, they're pretty god awful. As far as like, this should be a team that's competing to be, one of the best teams, or competing at least, relatively well against a somewhat unknown opponent, and they just get crushed. Right.
So is the Golden IGL style, or like what he could do, still available, or like is his like style outdated?
No, it's not the style. Like, the good thing about Counter-Strike is it's actually kind of like what League is like in the current meta today, but never was in the past. Actually, usually in Counter-Strike, all styles have I wouldn't say effective, but like you can play them if you have the right players, basically. Like Counter-Strike is very much more a game where you make the style around who you have on your team, not what the best style overall is. So, for example, when the Astralis team was number 1, most teams actually wouldn't have wanted to copy their style of play. It would make you worse. You wouldn't be able to do it. The level of execution would be too high. So the golden style of play, it still works. It's just basically my point was his style almost revolves around you have to have sort of better players. And in his case, better players in terms of like even individually making a decision, not even just being individually better with the gun. So you're actually putting an incredible amount of sort of demand upon very specific skill set for your team. So if some of the players don't have it, and spoilers, some of them really dropped off, like the JW player we're talking about is a legendary player who was cut. Yeah, if you're not as good, your entire style's going to collapse. Like I said, there'd be no reason you should be top 20 at that point.
Yeah, 100%. And, there's also a concept too, where it's like they have had, over the last, year or so, a kind of brain drain, like with, Flusha and now JW leaving. And that kind of eats away at some of that understanding of, kind of like what we're kind of building up earlier is this is a team that is normally used to relying on the instincts and the understandings of the individual players to make moves on the map, right? To like say, hey, I feel like they're not really taking a lot of mid presence, so we could, take some kind of cheap angles here early and maybe get a kill and win, a player up early in the game. It's kind of like, ganking a player, if you will. That takes a lot of intuitive knowledge of, how another player plays or another team plays that, maybe now they don't really have the capability of doing. I don't know how Alex, another IGL that, to be fair, plays in a kind of similar style. I don't know how much he leaned on that kind of, dependence on understanding of how the game is read when he was at Cloud9, where he was also playing with younger players that didn't really have a high experience as well.
So from my memory, I remember that the C9 games were always like super close, and like he was essentially working with like worse players than what FNATIC had. So I assume
100%. Yeah,
he'll do like better, assuming the players on FNATIC are better than what Cloud9 had at that time.
Yeah, and that's kind of the common consensus too, right? It's like ideally, like, okay, Alex, 2 unknown NA players, a couple of middling journeymen in the European scene. Theoretically, you slot him and a tool in his back pocket into FNATIC, and magic happens, right? I don't know how much magic is going to happen. These are like kind of, you can go on and kind of like list on like reasons why it would work, reasons why it wouldn't work. But at the end of the day, it's like that first match is going to tell you a whole lot of like how much has the style changed, how much has Alex's individual play contributed, how much has the new coach that they brought in individually contributed to how they're researching opponents and things like that. That's like, basically everyone's holding their breath waiting for that game to happen. Well, I don't know when it's going to be or where it's going to be, but that's like we're all holding our collective breath. And we'll kind of know if maybe there's some cultural issues. If it doesn't work out, maybe it's just a god tier mega mind move. If it does work out, right, we're kind of just building our storylines from for now until then, right?
Yeah, I think this is also like from what I heard, it's like also a high profile move. Like, are we expecting FNATIC to like be up top 4 or 5 or with this move? Or they
won't be that high up there. This is more like they could sort of start to make their way back to where they should be, which is like a top 10 team at a minimum. So they could be like a top 10 team, maybe out on the outskirts of top 10. We're talking like 10th, I would probably guess, and this is actually sort of what we didn't talk about, but was the bigger aspect of the move, which is the idea that they went away from being Swedish. So they're not limited to only getting people who are Swedish. So the key thing for me is, it's true, FNATIC the org, if you look in most games, hasn't made like big money signings, quite frankly, almost ever in the last few years. But if you just open it up to an international audience, there's also a world where maybe one more piece is all that's required. But if you get the team back to being top 10, then getting that last piece becomes a lot easier. And the fact that you're international means you could get anyone. You could get some kid out of FPL, whereas like Sweden, I mean, they didn't really even seem to produce many of those FPL type talents, to be fair.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're familiar with any kind of Counter-Strike right now, but the team that I would compare them to as of right now on paper is OG, where they have a lot of really good pieces that individually you could take them and put them in any team of their own nationality. You could be like, okay, yeah, that would make that team infinitely better. But together, I don't know. It's really hard to tell if that collectively as a team that this contributes to something that's bigger than the individual pieces, right? So I mean, theoretically, like the ceiling is, I would say number 3 in the world, because I think G2 is kind of shaky. I honestly am not 100% sold on that team. I think it's really good, but I think there's some there's some cracks in that foundation that I can't really get my head around. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, are you going to beat, Gambit or Navi? Yikes. I don't think so. I don't think there's many teams that could beat those teams, at least right now. Again, we just had a player break. We haven't really had a proper match in a little while, and we probably won't until I think Pro League starts. I think Pro League starts here soon. So, I mean, maybe those teams just kind of like, Navi's known to take a player break and just kind of jerk off in the corner and do nothing, and then come back and just get completely wrecked by everybody. So that's not out of the question. But maybe this FNATIC team, that's the ceiling, right? Like, now where are they actually going to end up? I don't know. Probably like 12. 12 is realistically like where if they do well, they put in the hours, they do they do some team play practice and things like that. They could realistically end up there. They're probably going to end up, getting some close games. If the history with Cloud9's to show anything, they're probably going to get some close games and get some top opponents, but still get wrecked. Like, they're not going to win any best of threes, I don't think.
Wisetown, do you have another topic we can switch to, mate?
Let me think about it.
Is there anything on your mind at the moment? Anything interesting to you at the moment?
Maybe perhaps like the G2 Mad Lions series just finished, and basically like the fall of to some extent G2 as like the Super Rock in EU, like how does that affect? How's that going to affect the LEC going forward, going into Worlds, and because they're gonna fight for the last spot if I'm not mistaken, right? They're gonna fight.
If they keep winning, yeah.
Yeah, they have to go through FNATIC, for instance, and so forth. But I think they're gonna have a tough time going into Worlds, of course. But how does that affect? Like, how does that change the landscape? Because now we've had so many years of like FNATIC and G2 dominance specifically, and of course Mad Lions won the last split. But I saw it as more of a fluke to some extent, because I'm a G2 supporter myself, so I was expecting them to come back. Not the ultimate champion, but a bit more competitive than they had shown throughout the entire split. Because I don't take only the last couple of weeks, because as we've discussed, people can find new strategies. Plus it's BO1, so you can't really take that as concrete evidence of the level of a team.
So just to kind of jump in and give some context. So Mad Lions won 3-1?
No, yeah, they won 3-1, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, basically the first game it seemed like G2 was like miles ahead of them. The way they played was really, really impressive, and then they just somehow collapsed from the looks of things. So,
Matt, what do you think on this, mate? Like, his central question is kind of more about the future. Like, obviously, even if G2 goes to Worlds, even if they win from the lower bracket, they're clearly not the powerhouse they were of the last years, like he's saying. So, what do you think it does to the overall LEC? Essentially, that they're not the clear top dog, as it were.
I think just the landscape and holding an era is pretty difficult, as we already stated in League of Legends. So I think 4 years is fine for G2, and we've seen Mad Lions and Rogue have both been really good teams the past two splits, right? So. Just the changing of top teams is just something that happens. So I think the G2 dominance and the FNATIC dominance, it's just the players aren't re-signed to these orgs, since we just had franchising and stuff, so that more orgs are better propped up. So just more players, and the lucky signs with Mad Lions with all those rookies. It's just new teams taking the place. So I think it's just overall good for the LEC to see more quality franchises than just G2 and FNATIC, and maybe people will become more fans of the league rather than G2 and FNATIC itself.
So am I smoking crack? Or is Mad Lions a decent org in League of Legends? Because in Counter-Strike they're kind of a joke.
Yeah, I've heard that they
would be considered right now a top 3 or top 4 org in a European League of Legends.
Oh wow, okay, all right, yeah, that's a contrast. Okay,
I don't think the company or whoever's behind Mad Lions, I don't really know, but their League of Legends presence is they're pretty good and quality based on just League itself.
Here's the thing though, what will make sense of it is this. The reason why is, if you remember what made them half decent in CSGO was they just bought Hundon's team, who was a great talent scout for lesser players, obviously. They basically did a better version of that in League of Legends. They got a guy called Peter Dunn, who actually now coaches in America with Evil Geniuses, but he basically is someone who know a lot about amateur and semi-pro level players, and he basically was able to make them a team of all rookies that became like one of the best teams in Europe. So they didn't do it by actually being an amazing org, beyond that they hired these people. So there's that, but it's probably more that they just locked into the right people who could sort of find your talent out of nowhere. They didn't like go and sign the biggest names and, you know, do like power player moves or some shit, you know.
Okay, so this is basically like Moneyball the team.
I mean, I hate that term, but like they have essentially used like lesser players. I'd say it's more just like you just found the next top player before he got into G2 or FNATIC, you know.
I think they just lucked out to some extent.
Basically, that's one of the factors that I'm going to tie into my answer to this, which is the good news is I do think that forever the landscape of LEC has changed. Like, I don't think it matters how good G2 is. G could even be the best team. Like, they might come back in the lower bracket and win this whole split. But what has changed forever is this. What the league was like for the last few years was like this. G2 had far and away the best players. We're talking about when they had like the super team. So at that point in time, obviously it was a little bit unfair how much talent they had. But then on top of that, FNATIC basically just became like, if you can't get into G2, you go to FNATIC because you think you're going to get a chance to play at least in the final and go to Worlds. So FNATIC had their own sort of unique way to still recruit talent, even though they weren't paying the most. And then after that, you actually didn't really have like a set third or fourth. Like if you remember, if you go back a few years ago, it was Vitality and Splice. Then you go to different years. I mean, who would you even say it was at that point? Obviously, it could have been Rogue at one point. Could have maybe even been a Schalke. Could have been Mad Lions themselves. Like, you had these teams. Well, the problem is the two teams that went from being like dark horse status to now legit contenders are Mad Lions and Rogue, and they both did it the same way. They both just did really great GM work. They went out there and they got the rookies before they became good enough that these top teams, FNATIC and G2, would have taken them. And so basically that means already you've got, in theory, on paper, bear in mind FNATIC continue to like recruit good players. That's already 4 orgs right there who can all put together potentially championship winning rosters. Now, I do think some of the other teams probably don't build on it. Like, for example, the team that replaces Schalke, I actually think most of what was allowing Schalke to win was actually Dylan Falco as their coach. I think if you just look at the teams he's been on, he's a guy who's just very good at using whatever he's got. Well, that team's gone, basically, so I don't know that they'll replace them. There are still good pieces out there. Obviously, Excel and Vitality are teams that potentially are a move or two away from being a dark horse to win the league. So I do think from now on, the cool thing is the GMs are actually doing their job. Before it was just players, and as a result, players joined the good players, and eventually you just get a funnel of like 1 or 2 teams at the top that are all the top players. I actually think now it's like you've got real teams that make sense. You don't have all the talent stacked into one squad. I mean, you even have so much talent, even with G2 and Rogue essentially having like almost all LEC teams. You still have all these other top teams. So the cool thing for me is it actually might be a world where the entire playoffs in future years can legitimately win the league, which was definitely not the case almost ever in European League of Legends. Like, if people don't know, one of FNATIC or G2 was in every final ever until last split.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess the franchises and the people behind them, the coaches, I think are like standard pieces. Like, they're not moving from those teams, I don't think. So it's more continuity. That's true. And those franchises being more likely to stay on top.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. So what does the amateur scene in League of Legends look like? Like, how, what kind of pool of talent are they?
It's fantastic. It's the best in all of esports, mate, basically. Like, beyond Asian regions where like all the Asians just play the game and they have a bazillion people you can pick from, like China. In European League of Legends, it's actually the only scene I'm aware of in esports that has actually for real made some sort of a pipeline to pro, as it were. They basically made the equivalent of like academy leagues that you were talking about in CSGO, but they just have it's like European soccer. They have an entire subdivision that is just below the top level where you play as if you were in a top pro team and you're in a league, like you're like in the French league, the German league, whatever, Polish league. You play in that league, you play as if you were a pro. You're playing probably with someone on your team as a veteran who was a pro, so you've even got like the sports element of, as a young player, you get to sort of learn a little bit from an older pro as you sort of pass each other like ships in the night. You go up, he goes down, but maybe he can pass some knowledge onto you or help you out and fast track your game. And as a result of this like full second division, as it were, it means that you've got so many prospective talents to look at across all the different minor European leagues that, if anything, in League, they've got the opposite problem to what you'd expect, which is they actually at the moment overvalue the rookie talent because there's been so many potential, like this guy could be good, that at the moment they're all just gambling because it costs less money. Why don't we all just pick rookies constantly? And then if some of us end up with top players, like jokes on everyone else. So at the moment, if anything, they're going too far the other way in league where they're sort of like undervaluing the good veteran who like could still be good in a year from now, you know?
Yeah, the real testament to the ERLs is essentially Elyoya coming out like learning and developing professional play in a year or two, I think. And then he just comes in like essentially MVP and our best player in the league when they won.
Wow.
From jungle.
Interesting. Yeah, that kind of ties into the point we were kind of talking about earlier, which is where, you know, that starts to affect the, you know, the relationship you have with some of the more veteran talent, right? So I mean, LS, he used to be a really big talent in the scene, right? I mean, and you know, kind of was he just eventually replaced by a rookie that was eventually better than him?
Oh no, LS wasn't a player. He's like a thinker about the game. Basically, LS, like here's the extreme version. This doesn't really work, but obviously there is no overlap between two games. In the sense, as LS is essentially in League of Legends what I am in CS:GO. Like he's a very outspoken figure that wasn't a pro player, but still has like some cultural cachet. People who like his content, it's kind of niche, but they're like very loyal in that sense. Again, like a Marmite person, you either hate them or you love them, and has like, again, almost similarly kind of like a contentious relationship with players because some players are going to like you and fuck with your vibe. Some players just can't handle ever being criticised by someone who isn't a pro. So they like basically he also gets like some pros who go against him or whatnot. No, he wasn't a pro player. He's, like I say, in fact, funnily enough, part of what's allowed him to bring a lot of innovative thinking to League of Legends, by the way, is he literally is someone who has been at a pro level in games like Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone and, you know, all the card games, etc. So actually a lot of his thinking in League of Legends, he even literally uses terminology from like Magic the Gathering. Like when he breaks down the way the draft works, for example, he actually brought in sort of meta thinking of how you how decks work against each other with the collars in Magic. So actually, that's why to me he's a very interesting character. But he wasn't a pro. It wasn't like that.
Okay, right.
He was always in the theoretical, as it were.
Yeah, kind of the greater point is like, you know, these, you know, when we, you know, kind of what you're alluding to earlier, which where there's like an overall reliance on, you know, younger talent. Is like, does that have like an effect on the brand loyalty or brandability of certain players to kind of make a reputation for themselves?
That hasn't been a problem yet, as in like a lot of the big names still will get a team. Like I said, some of them even just play the RLs if they can't get an LEC. Like you can still. That's actually the one good part as well. Even if you're not going to get to play an LEC, they've also gotten the RLs now, like business wise, so that you can actually get like a pretty decent salary. You can have like a proper. You can be in a team house and you can have a proper team. Like I say, they're not just LARPing at being pros. They've essentially made a legitimate second division. So it all depends. Like, there's certain people who are massive names that aren't on teams, for example, which is kind of a bit like what's going on in CSGO. And also, I would even say there's a similar factor because even though League isn't as mechanically intensive, it's another game where if you take away the pressure of really being in front of a crowd, like you definitely see a way larger variance of who can win the game. So I will say some of that could also rectify itself. Like I personally suspect it will in Counter-Strike in a year from now. Like I basically think in a year from now in Counter-Strike, assuming we're back to all LAN play, you'll see a bunch of people who seemed like they were hot shit in the online era just drift back into tier 2 and tier 3. And meanwhile, I guarantee, I don't know who it will be, someone out there will pick up one of these washed veterans, Kenny S, Guardian, and one of them's at least one or two are going to become really good players again. That's just the cycle of things if you follow the game long enough.
Yeah. For instance, like I just don't see, you know, kind of to tie it into your point about, you know, there's no way that these teams could be nearly as good, you know, when there's not necessarily the pressure, especially when it comes to younger players, you know, and having to deal with the pressure and things like that. You know, there's no way that Gambit's this good, you know, on LAN. I mean, it's just not going to happen. You know, they are really good. No discredit to them, but there's no way that they're this good, you know, on LAN, you know. And I don't think I think Navi's also getting an online bump for sure. You know, they were good at this LAN, but I don't think that's. I honestly, I'm super not sold on Navi. I watch that team and it just makes me cry. It feels so wrong. Like I don't know. s1mple just breaks my brain.
Do you have another topic, Matt? Do you have something else you wanted to go to?
Yeah, I got something to go on.
Yeah, go on.
So I was pretty interested with the CSGO economy video or what you talked about and the Chargers only format.
All right.
And so essentially just to get around like developers interluding and producing formats, like how could like even people implement that, and like how would be good? Like essentially, like for League, I would essentially like have everything best of 5s and then like enable FFs if teams know that they're over, so they could keep going in the game and that sort of stuff. But like charges only sounds like a more interesting thing or could talk about.
Well, basically, the reason why like people speculated on it is exactly as you said. You don't need the game. You don't need Valve's permission to do it. Like I could run a tournament right now, and me and you could play a game of charges only. Because I mean, you don't even literally need, by the way, the game engine itself to recognize it as a format. You just count only the terrorist rounds won. So if we both just play a game now and we just use a custom server setting and put the rounds to, I don't know, like in this case, you just put a time limit. So you just put like 20-minute game, and then I'd play T side for the 20 minutes. See how many rounds I got, right? I got 8 rounds, let's say. Then we load up the server again. You take a turn on T side. If you get to 8 rounds or more within 20 minutes, you win the game. If you don't get to 8 rounds, I win the game. That's why I say it's actually also, funnily enough, it's a very good analog for what is basically the sport element that comes the closest to Counter-Strike, which is Counter-Strike tactics are obviously very similar to like how an NFL offense works. Well, essentially this would make it like that. I mean, it's not entirely the same because obviously there is the wrinkle that a defense can score as well in the NFL if they get a takeaway and they just score a touchdown. So you couldn't have that element, but it's similar. It would have I think actually like people who understand the NFL would very quickly get what we're doing in Counter-Strike, because also that's the big appeal of it, is that in the moment in Counter-Strike, assuming the game doesn't end, you only ever get 15 T rounds. It will always be 15. It will never be 1. It will never be 20. Again, obviously, you can lose the game before you play your entire T side. So ignoring that context, the difference in this scenario is if you just have 20 minutes on your T side, you have all the spectrum of strategical decision making. Like, for example, if I barely got many rounds on my T half, maybe you choose to play a very slow, methodical game and just say, right, execution means I'm definitely going to get my, say, 3 or 4 rounds over 20 minutes. So I'll take it slow. I won't rush it. I won't gamble much. I'll just kind of play out some very simple things I think will work, and I'll eventually get over the line. Meanwhile, if I had an incredible T half and I got like 15 T rounds, you're probably going to have to take a whole bunch of gambles. So that's why I say it's like an NFL game. If the clock comes back to me and I'm on offense in the NFL, but I'm down by loads of points, yeah, I have to go for some crazy-ass plays, and I better like really get the chains moving. If on the other hand, I'm even leading in the game and I'm at that point, yeah, I can kind of cruise, can't I? I can take it very simple. I can play really safe. So the cool thing about it is, I think, in my opinion, if you can actually get people's heads around it, which is the main challenge, like people are going to have to step outside their comfort zone for, let's say, a few months. The upside of it is incredible. Like, it basically is. I've made videos about this in the past. It's basically sort of the alternate dimension of where Counter-Strike could have been an even better game.
Oh yeah, and Matt, I thank you for bringing that up, because I fuck with chargers only, because listen, if we first off, like from a like, can this even be implemented in the game? If we can have surf as a game mode, we can have this as a game mode. Like it's technically possible, 100%, right? I'm sure there's a mod that exists. You can still play Trouble in Terrorist Town in Counter-Strike, for fuck's sake. So I mean, from a technical perspective, it should be slam dunk, right? But from when you think about how you think about the game in Counter-Strike as it currently exists, you have a finite amount of rounds to play with, and you have to win or lose those rounds. And that makes you think in a certain way, right? Like there's lots of, as I was talking about before, where we have a certain amount of time to think about the things that we need to do in order to win the game, right? There isn't a lot of room for maneuvering because we've already thought about how you play the game. Okay, if we lose pistol, we save one by AKs next round, right? There's lots of mental shortcuts that you do to get you into the next round that matters, right? And but with chargers only, it throws all of that away, right? So it starts to exercise more fundamentals of the games. Okay, it's a pistol round. How do we end this round as quickly as possible, right? And maybe that is something that is, on paper, it sounds interesting, really. On paper, it sounds excellent, right? Once you get it into the game, experiencing that as a game, you start to draw parallels with things you've done that are very similar with it. NFL is a perfect example, right? There's a wide history of different kinds of strategy based around, okay, do we run, what's the goalpost and how do we get there in an efficient manner, right? We start a different kind of evolution of the game that's in a different world just based on a different rule set that the game follows now. And some of the current thinkers that are in the game, playing on the fixed rounds MR15, maybe if we had put them into something like a Chargers only, that completely shifts the way that that their game is approached and makes them more valid, less valid, whatnot. But
it would make some IGLs worse and better, 100%.
Oh, 100%, right? So I mean, there's a whole bunch of tactical depth that's yet to be undiscovered. It's almost like a new game in a sense, right? So, and I mean, maybe that from a technical perspective is the best way to kind of, jump into it. It's like, see what Valorant did with, hey, we have Counter-Strike, but let's augment it a little bit and make it something that's unique and enjoyable in its own right? They didn't necessarily do that with the, how the rounds play out and things like that. They chose to do that with abilities and powers and how do we change up utility to be it more character derived as compared to economy derived, right? That kind of shake up, maybe that is another game all to its own. Maybe there's Counter-Strike Chargers only, like who knows? The source engine is incredibly flexible. If you follow a fellow by the name of Zool, he completely breaks the game wide open on a regular basis, making things like Halo mod and things like that. Completely wild, crazy things that the source, maybe the source engine was never meant to do, but ends up doing because it's just an enjoyable way of enjoying the game. So maybe, hey, Zool, if you're out there listening, please, Chargers only. That'd be great.
Anyone else have any thoughts on this topic? Should we move it on?
It's a quick question.
Keep going.
In the course of implementing it, what would it take to have someone run this rule set? And could you even get it in any of the big organizers?
This is the main problem, mate. It's believe it or not, I know because you're coming from League, you're in a world where it's wow, unless the God Riot does everything, we can't do anything. But the sad thing is, in CSGO, everything is possible. We can do it all. The problem then becomes the problem with most things in the world, fucking people, innit? So the real issue here, believe it or not, is there are so many tournaments in Counter-Strike. It's a massive, wide open circuit that easily any of the top tournament organizers, ESL, DreamHack, you could go through the list. Any of them could run a one-off tournament. They could run a couple. They could run, alternating. They could do whatever they wanted. It would be very easy to actually run the tournament. The problem is this: pro players would be the most resistant people to even trying this style because of two factors. One, it's just not what they're used to, and a lot of people. I mean, it's one of the things I actually learned as a quick side tangent from an author that I was very into when I was in when I was about, say, 20. He was a guy called Robert Anton Wilson, which is he made this point that you can sort of divide people into two camps. They're either infophilic or infophobic, and essentially it's the idea of do you like new information? Do you neophobic rather? I mean, do you like things to be new and fresh and exciting, or do you prefer them to sort of be safe and comfortable in what they were? It's basically the political divide in the world in most cases, although obviously then you get in a whole tangent of what defines if something is better or worse, which is basically where the divide exists. The problem is this, right? Most people aren't wanting to innovate and do new things and try something radical. They kind of just want things to be how they are now, the rules to be established, they can play within them, and they get as good as they are, and crucially, and this is the second point, you consolidate what you've already got. So if you're already a top 10 player in the world, it's actually not in your bet. Even though I'm telling you, if you're a really great player, you're going to be even better at this game mode, and in fact, it's going to expose some of your rivals. They're going to think to themselves, yeah, but maybe there's a world I'm just not as good at that version of the game, or maybe that fucks with something about my game understanding. So unfortunately, in the past, when this has been brought up, it's been brought up many times over the last 20 years, that was nearly always the response from pros. It was only the pros that actually were around when we had Chargers only at the very beginning of the 2000s and 2001. They're the only ones who were open to the idea. Most other pros just thought why bother? We've already got a good mode, and plus I don't want to play this new, and they weren't even open to sort of the premise of doing it, So that's why I always bring it up as it's a good abstract, I do think it would solve a lot of the problems, but I always tell people basically I wouldn't hold my breath that pro players are going to implement this. So I personally think at the moment, if you look at the scene, a lot of the tournament formats are actually just based around what the tournament organizer thinks the pro players want, because a lot of them are scared, believe it or not, that some legendary pro player like Fallen just flames the format or some shit, and then morons on Reddit just go, oh yeah, whatever he said, oh wow, this tournament organizer sucks. So at the moment it would actually just kind of be fear of something new that I actually think would hold a lot of pros back. If they had to vote to use this format, I don't think they would do it, unfortunately. So personally, It's like I always say about when you bring new maps into the pool. I would like it if you just did like a one-off tournament where the whole point of the tournament was just to play the new thing. So if it had been a new map, you have a tournament that's just ancient, for example, and then everyone just plays it. It's a fun way to introduce everyone to the game quickly. I'd like it if you did that with charges only. You know, just do a couple of like semi-pro level tournaments with teams that you know, but it doesn't have to be the absolute best teams. And then it's more just to get people adjusted to the idea of, do they actually get the premise? If they don't like the premise once they get it, that's fine, of course. Yeah, we can stick with what we've got. But you almost have to like trick people into trying it, I think, before they would actually get it.
Yeah, just kind of jump on that. It's like, there's almost like this idea of like, well, how do we get charges only introduced? It's almost like the same question as how do we start this new esport? Like how do you start an esport, right? You have a bunch of people who play, who are competitive about it, and then take that competition and start putting it against each other, right? I mean, honestly, like we probably need, an accessible version of this, right? I'll be keeping my eye on the community server browser, even though that will probably start causing my eyes to bleed. But it's something like that where it's like there's some kind of incentive to get good at it, right? And some kind of, ideally it's got to be fun, right? Because I mean, it's been around for a long time, so theoretically we've already kind of proven it's pretty engaging and pretty entertaining as a format, right? But the idea is that if I'm going to come home from my day at work and then sit down, load up Counter-Strike and play charges only and enjoy it, and then watch someone else play it and watch somebody else exploit the game in a different way, and then you get enjoyment out of that is another question altogether, right? Surely it's better. Again, all of this is on paper, right? It's kind of like, what's the point of podcasts? You're just listening to people talk, right? What's the point of, putting a format on paper if it's not any fun or if it's not any engaging or no one's willing to try it, right? I mean, the idea is that if we got to get it created first, and then we start to play it, and because this honestly is like something I think I would enjoy playing just as its own. So I mean, and then ideally, right, just like with esports that have come up for the grassroots, you get a whole bunch of people who are interested and are willing to compete and willing to push the level of the game, and then hopefully you get some kind of informative and enjoyable experience out of it. Maybe Shroud, maybe that's his next excuse to load up Counter-Strike next time. I don't know. We'll see.
The sad thing is that technically I myself could have been the person I was referring to earlier who just ran the tournament. Like, obviously I could have done that at Flashpoint if I still worked with them. Unfortunately, that was obviously like totally coincidental. Like, it has nothing to do with that, but I just don't happen to work with the company anymore. Because the problem is this. If you didn't notice, the reason why Flashpoint ran an RMR this year, originally the plan was to just run a normal Tier 1 tournament and invite all the best teams, and we would just run it. And the idea was the only teams that were the partner teams that would get into it would be if they qualified. Like, a couple of them would have had to play the open qualifier, so most of them wouldn't make it in. So they were open to pivoting the concept of Flashpoint, because obviously the original premise of being a franchise league didn't work. It just wasn't making it. So in theory, I think we could have potentially talked them into doing something like this, like do a one-off tournament, and that would be the gimmick, that we'd be the only charges only tournament. The problem is, I doubt anyone who's currently there is going to do that, and indeed the project itself may not exist much longer, so that's kind of a missed opportunity there, but whatever. Then again, I wasn't in the scene just to run fucking formats. Like, that's just, it's just unfortunately an opportunity that you couldn't take advantage of.
I had a quick question on the...
Doesn't have to be quick. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So, are there historical examples? Like, I could go watch like an ancient only tournament.
Unfortunately, no.
Done.
No one's ever done these things we're talking about. Like, you in theory, you could watch charges only, but the problem is you'd have to load up an old demo from the beginning of the original Counter-Strike, which wouldn't even work except on an old version. I doubt they're actually even on YouTube for that, because remember, we didn't have VODs back in the old versions of Counter-Strike. The games weren't streamed until the end of the game. So, unfortunately, there's no version of charges only you can really watch, as far as I know. And like I say, no one's ever actually done... That's actually my idea, is the idea of when a new map comes along, why don't we have just a tournament with just that map in it? I think that would be a fun way to make everyone sort of... It'd be like cramming for an exam, everyone would just say good within 1 week. How good can anyone get at it? Unfortunately, no one's ever tried these ideas. They're just pipe dreams at the moment. Probably the worst thing about Counter-Strike is it has all these vistas of things you could do and that you don't even need people's permission for. But kind of like we were talking about with that first topic about teams not innovating, you wouldn't believe how many entities within the Counter-Strike space just look to their left, look to their right, look what everyone else is doing and just do that. And don't, their real logic is, I would rather be the 8th best at doing X than the best at doing Y, because what if Y isn't popular? Which is like, to me, that is a loser's mindset. Like a winner's mindset is you go for it all. You know, you try to win. So if that means innovating, then that might be your path to success. Otherwise, you have to be better at what you do than the other guy does. So it's got to be one of the two.
Yeah, and it kind of like itches at the the struggles of the free market, right? Like theoretically, the markets are free; you could do whatever you want. The market is there; go capitalize on it, right? But at the end of the day, if there's no incentive to draw that that innovation, right? There's no incentive to draw that capital to the open market, then there is no action to be done, right? I mean, that's something that I guess we've the free and open world has struggled with for the last 50 or 60, I don't know, 70 years, and since the end of the Cold War, really. If you really want to bring it up on a bigger scale.
Do we have one last topic? I think one last one we could probably fit in here.
Okay, I might have one here.
Let's do it.
This might be a controversial one to bring up, but now I've been watching some of s1mple's like play since like 2018 now, like rewatching it, and then coming from League of Legends, I have heard like so much that he is so much about him, like he's the faker of Counter-Strike. But since his more like his improvement, as crazy as it might sound, this year, is it possible to say that he might actually have gone further than Faker ever did, actually, when it comes to his play? I'm not talking about his achievements and accolades, but his play specifically. I know it's two different games, but it's just a fun thought exercise too.
I've got some bad news for you.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of my CSGO stuff you've listened to, because I know when I'm in League, obviously I'm just in League, aren't I? Like, I'm not just shitting on the game all the time, because that is what people are there to hear and listen to. Mate, to me, League is a little kid's game. I always have to stress this to the Counter-Strike people. I'm from Quake, mate. Counter-Strike's a little kid's game to me. If you play Quake, you look at Counter-Strike the same way the League of Legends guy looks at Fortnite. You go like, that's for little kids. Like, come and play a real game if you want to play a fucking game, mate. So my problem is this. To me, when I praise Faker as like some transcendent player, what I'm basically saying to you is, I don't even think the game he plays is that good, but he really is so exceptionally good at it. He deserves to like at least be in the convo with people from like the super hardcore games, like, Flash from StarCraft, s1mple, or you could go to a different Counter-Strike example like Neo from 1.6 or something. Like, I'm actually giving Faker props more than the game there. Yeah. So the problem is this: CSGO is a way better and way harder game than League of Legends. So in my opinion, I actually think on an individual basis, s1mple's already far exceeded what Faker did. Faker was like the absolute best in the world for, let's say, maybe like disparately 3 separate years out of like a 6-year span or something, which is still extremely good and incredibly difficult in League of Legends, a game that a massive amount of people play and put mad hours into. So that is insane for Faker. The problem is this, like, basically, if you think of like the best 3-month span that Faker ever had in his career, maybe it would be like summer 2015, maybe summer 2013, whatever period you think was Faker's peak, right? Imagine he just did that and just kept doing it the whole time, and it wasn't a 3-year span. That was just the first year, and then another year, and then he did it for like 5 years, and each year he was getting better each year. That's basically what s1mple did.
Yeah.
So it's actually the other way around. And now you're right, everyone in esports still does that pleb thing of like, it's just about trophies. So they'll say the opposite, mate. They'll say, no, he maybe if he wins 3 majors, he can be like Faker. But if you actually do like the eye test, it's the other way around, if anything. Like, Faker was a god, but his problem is I don't think the game allowed me to really see if he's as good as someone like s1mple is in CSGO, if you get my point.
Yeah, of course. It's the narrative that's surrounding Faker more than the actual like eye test.
I mean, no, Faker was the absolute greatest player in League. But yeah, what I mean is like, the problem with Faker is this, is if you like narratives, he's got all of them, hasn't he? Because he was like, I test the best, and he had the trophies, and his longevity, So in League, yeah, he's sort of undisputed the best. But if you compare him to people from other games, you have to take into account the game as well. Like, to me, I'm actually going to do a piece of content on this soon, because people don't get it. They think when I say s1mple's like the best CSGO player ever, like, oh, you're just overhyping him, or blah, blah, blah. What they don't realise is, even in Counter-Strike, I'm elitist. Like, I think CS 1.6 was way harder than CSGO. So to me, the fact that s1mple's done this in CSGO, I actually think makes him probably the best Counter-Strike player, period. Like, he's probably better than 1.6 guys relative even to their period. Because, mate, even they weren't like the absolute best every single tournament, every single, like, just in a row. Even they would have a tournament where they were like the 4th best or something, Like, to me, he genuinely is, no joke, That's why Faker's the good comparison. You shouldn't, in the same ways you shouldn't overuse the term genius, you shouldn't have too many people in these like conversations for the best player ever in esports. Like realistically, like s1mple, Faker, Flash, like these people, there might be like 6 names that really deserve to be in that like greatest ever esports player list.
Yeah. And I mean, if you put into context the career that s1mple has, even now to date, 2021, he's been one of, if not the best player. He's been in the discussion for 5 years. That is an incredible amount of time. Every year for 5 years, he has been absolutely off the wall incredible. I don't think there's a single other player that has done it that well, done it that long, with that many cards stacked against him, with that many, obstacles in his way. If you look at the teams that he's been on, and he's still the best player, it baffles my mind, because on paper he should not be the best. The teams he's played on have been some of the least supportive teams as far as facilitating a star player. Some of the teams he's played on have almost put him in an active detriment in the game as far as the equipment goes. Some of the players he's played with have been incredibly selfish in the way that they play the game around s1mple. It is unfathomable that you could even be a good player in that team, yet he still is the best player. Like it's when you think about proportionality as far as there is the best, but what does that mean in the greater context of all of esports, right? If you think of where on the scale of things, a player is, it's hard. It is incredibly hard to think of a player who has stood out that far away from the rest of the crowd for that long over such a huge span of time. It is almost disingenuous to compare them to any other player in any other best player of their given esport, because it's so uncomparable. The amount of context, it's almost undoable to pile on the amount of context and still maintain a actually realistic comparison with any other player, right?
Plus, you have to throw in other contexts as well. Like, for example, Faker comes from theoretically the best region in the league. Like, even if the LPL, the Chinese region, is better, spoiler, a bunch of their top players are also the best Koreans that were imported. So, Korea is still amazing, right? s1mple comes to the CIS region. Like, I don't know if you know much about Counter-Strike, but there was one team ever from the CIS region, basically the former Soviet, and it was the original Na'Vi from 1.6 that was ever, the true number one team in the world, true, dominant team. So he's also doing it from a very hard region. And if you contrast the games, Faker's GMs or whoever was making his teams way better than the ones that did it for Na'Vi. Faker genuinely had some years where they just re-upped him with among the best talent you could get. s1mple's had very hit and miss talent put around him, sometimes good, sometimes atrociously bad, as basically Kris was just saying.
From what I've heard, s1mple is technically amazing, genius level, but is he also on the reading opponents and psychologically?
That's probably the area basically where he sort of leveled up the most the last few years. Once upon a time, if you go back to the beginning of the 5-year span Kris was talking about, he would have been then more considered just like early Caps was in season 7, just raw mechanical genius, amazing skill. But, sometimes it ints the game, sometimes does the wrong move or goes overly aggressive. The point is now he also what makes s1mple literally a character out of a movie. He's basically an anime protagonist. He not only has an unlimited skill ceiling, which he constantly progresses towards in linear fashion, but he simultaneously, like the anime character, learns the life lessons that make you a better person simultaneously. And so at the end, every fucking anime protagonist is overpowered as fuck, aren't they? They're just the ultimate god that can defeat anyone. He's basically like that in CSGO, because one of the crazy things about him was, even when he was already the best player, and we were all calling him the best player ever in 2018, he still used to literally think, I'm not my general manager, therefore I can't really control the teammates I have, so I should actually still keep working, even on things like my mind for the game or how the tactics of the game work, and try and level up my thinking, because even every tiny 0.1% I had when I'm as good as I am now might win me the game. So he actually also, in a sense, has the craziest work ethic ever. So basically, yeah, he's also a very smart player in the game. I'd also compare him to Faker in that
I
sense,
feel
you
like
know.
I don't know if this is a disingenuous comparison, but it seems like he's more similar to if I had to put a sports example up, it's like Michael Jordan before the Bulls era, like way before that, with when he had his rough years with
Yeah, that's a good example
against the Pistons, where he couldn't perform, he had to bulk up physically the same way that s1mple had to remove the rough edges around.
Yeah, just do every extra thing you can do to win. Yeah, no, that's a good analogy, mate, because if people don't know, like, it's funny that now, if you ask any basketball fan, especially a Zoomer, they're going to tell you the reason Michael Jordan's the best player ever is because he won all the championships, right? What they don't realise is the joke is, s1mple and Michael Jordan had the exact same stigma, which is people used to literally say about Michael Jordan in the 80s, well, the scoring leader never wins the NBA title, so you're just a selfish player who's really amazing because you do it at the expense of your teammates, and you won't ever win because you don't understand how to play team ball, insert... Could be Isaiah Thomas, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, the players who were in the best teams, basically. Well, the joke is, obviously, when he then got the good teams around him and then won all the titles, it just ended the discussion, didn't it? But a lot of people might not know. A bunch of his peers already thought Michael Jordan was the best at the end of the 80s before he won any titles. So it's the same with s1mple. Yeah, not only have people publicly tried to set similar storylines up, for example, there's not many people do, but there's still some people say he has to win the major, otherwise he can't be the best ever. But I would also say as well that the way people characterize, basically the way you break them down, if you really are the best ever, unless it's a really debatable game, usually, eventually, even your haters sort of gradually dwindle in numbers because you just show it too much in the game. And so just like Michael Jordan did, I would say the contrast is pretty good for s1mple as well. By the end, even if he doesn't win a major, by the end of CSGO, I don't think it will even be a debate. I think it will almost be a unanimous case, kind of like people say for Wayne Gretzky in hockey or something, you know.
Yeah. And s1mple's, I don't think, kind of to talk about his mindset a little bit, is I don't think he's ever the kind of player who's going to overstay his welcome on a team. You know what I mean? Because then this is a player who, he has been staring down the barrel, especially say from 2018, right? He could have won everything, but the team that he was on put him in the circumstances where he couldn't. Right. And, there was that rumor where he and Electronic were basically going to go and join basically a international super team, but he didn't. Right. And he still chose to grind and chose to improve himself. And I think there was also some things that fell through just circumstantially. Right. But I mean, the idea that he stays on a subpar team, it sees the mistakes that his team is making and goes, how do I carry more? How can I win the game? How can I fix my mindset so this player is a little better? That is you will never see that. I don't think you'll ever see it again. It's so uncommon. It's so rare, especially in these high pressure moments. This is his legacy every day that he is theoretically putting to the side in in a stoic manner to build up an even greater legacy down the road. You will never ever see it again. I would love to be wrong, but I don't think you will ever see it again. And to compare him to other players is I would love to see it again, but I don't think we ever will in any other esport.
This video was kindly supported by Kris with a K, Lager15, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Shenlong, Travis Goff, Wisetown, Zachary Carter, Zack Schmidt, Adam Ochs, Alexander Rao, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Kris, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, John Shelton, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and a special thanks goes out to both Jerky's Minion and Joshua Gardner. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask one of those questions for my video AMA. Do you want teasers? Find out who the guests are for my upcoming shows. Maybe you even want to be a nerd having a long 2 or 3 hour discussion with me about anything on one of those video discussions. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.